Welcome to the Exegesis panel. I'd just like to briefly introduce our guests. Jonathan Lethem, of course, needs no introduction. It's because of him that this Exegesis project had happened, and we'll hear more about that. Pamela Jackson is in the unfortunate position of having read the whole thing a couple of times. And, if you're interested, you should really read her dissertation, because the Exegesis is difficult to read, but she's done a Herculean job of summarizing and explaining what's going on. And it's really just a foundation of the criticism that's to come. That's her. Rich Doyle is a liberal arts professor at Penn State, and he's written the afterword to the Exegesis, and if you're into some of the kind of more far-out stuff, he's the go-to guy. Speaking of far-out stuff, Erik Davis has been charting the fringes of esoteric mysticism and just strange thought. He's also an expert on California writing, and he brings that perspective to Philip K. Dick, which I think is another neglected area. He wasn't just a weird mystic writing the Exegesis, he was a California writer. Finally, David Gill, and let me just say a few words about our guy, David Gill. We haven't done enough to thank him or to recognize his input. I've known Dave a couple of years now, and everything that I didn't learn in the Sutton bio, I have learned from him, hearing about how he's just been the mover and the shaker in this community, both fan and scholarly. He knows everybody. He knows where all the bodies are buried. Also, one of the things that's most valuable about Dave's work is that he's teaching Philip K. Dick. He's teaching the book. He's moved a lot of copies, as we heard earlier. But also, he's just in the thick of things, getting his hands dirty, making it happen, and learning by practicing, which is an important part of the learning process, right? So he has plenty of insight into what it's like helping people write about Philip K. Dick, how to teach a class and talk about it, how to, ask the right questions. What the hell is this all about, you guys? And to elicit a good response. So it's that kind of training that makes him just a privileged observer of this kind of thing. So my first question, and I'd like to just go around the panel, is could you just, each of you, tell us about your role in the production of this text?
Well, there are stories within stories, and I have to make sure I don't take up too much time with this. But as I'll have a chance to share with you tonight, if you're around for what's being called my keynote address, whenever I'll do at 7, I'm going to definitely want to talk about the very early days of the Philip K. Dick estate and the newsletter in the Paul Williams era, which I was intimately involved in by dumb good luck on my part. And that was when I became aware of the presence of this body of writings. And I became aware of it in a really simple and strange way, and that is that I would visit Glen Ellen, and Paul Williams would show me pages of things that were in his garage. He'd show me a lot of neat stuff that was in his garage that had just basically been, parked there in bewilderment and helplessness by the estate in its very, very early phase of Dick's posthumous career, when even his masterpiece novels were, for the most part, completely out of print, and the core of people who cared about his established writings, let alone his unpublished, impossible to publish, private, spiritual, speculative, philosophical, pages, was facing a universe of skepticism. So this was just a kind of marvelous appendage to a puzzle, which was how do we make people know what we know, which is how important a novelist he is, how terrific a writer he is. And, oh yes, and then there's this thing. And it was a great thing to talk about, and I think in some ways this idea that there were secret writings actually, it was a kind of battery. Just the possibility, the notion of it was something that energized that early posthumous career. Even as the primary effort was, as it should have been, to get all the great books into print, to get his name into a kind of framework where he could be considered for the various forms of canonization and legitimation and just celebration that we've seen so marvelously occur over those decades subsequently. But I think the idea that, and what's more, there's this terra incognita. There's this strange voyage that, he might have cracked the code of the secrets of the universe incidentally as well. This was something that gave people a kind of fervor and fascination that I think actually helped with the frontline effort. But it was always in the back seat in those days. It was just, it's beyond consideration for publication. Doing things like getting the unpublished mainstream novels out, which were coherent books, that seemed like a brave effort, and it was accomplished in those years by very small presses. But, okay, I promised you the short version. Cut to many years later, and I can tell some of these stories again later on. I had, in a sense, come full circle after Paul's injury and also his disconnection from the actual activities of managing the estate. I was less in touch with those backstories. I was enjoying the Dick revival, and I was speaking for the Dick revival in sort of a public way, but I wasn't connected to the activities of the estate. And so the notion of what had happened to the exegesis and this strange problem or prospect or this whisper about this unpublishable or impossible manuscript wasn't something I had any special access to until I sat down with Dick's daughters, Laura and Isa, and had a conversation with them. This was at very grand at the poolside at the Chateau Marmont. And it was a wonderful kind of reconnection because I felt that they'd exactly taken over a story that I'd been part of the early days of. So we compared notes, and I sort of talked about what you might call the newsletter era, and they talked about the post-newsletter era, and we connected some dots. And I got to talking with them about the exegesis, and they had received a kind of baseline verdict. And this is, truthfully, it was Russell Gale who instilled this verdict in the unpublishable, and it's just as well. It was A, there's no publishing logistics in the universe that can make this happen, and B, you'd be better off if it didn't happen. And they were, not that they don't think for themselves, but I think they were recipients of this verdict with a certain amount of relief. It just gave them a way to not think about something very, very hard to deal with and think about. And so they were in a position, and had been in a position of just fending off inquiry, essentially, for a long time. And I began, at that point, to seed them with the notion that actually his reputation, his career, his importance, all of this has graduated in many different ways to a level where I believe there was some version of a larger exegesis than the glimmers we've gotten from the Sutton volume was publishable in some framework. I wasn't sure what framework. I had various thoughts for them if they were interested. And B, it was also inevitable in the longest run. I pointed out to them that a writer of the importance that he'd been now accorded was destined to be studied and published in some way to the very ends of their extant papers. Every letter, every early draft was going to basically be, in the sense that the archives of, the way Nabokov was inevitably, we were going to see those file cards for his last novel that unfortunately really weren't more than file cards, but we were destined to see them. The way, I'll talk about this more later, but it's a necessity that these things be made accessible. And so basically, without wanting to be too dramatic about it, I said to Laura and Isa, this is going to happen under your stewardship, or you're going to leave it for someone to do later. But these pages will be seen. And if you want to choose the framework and you want to control this and also participate in it because it'll be an exciting experience, I think you should think about it. And I'll help you think about it if you want to. And I began to be the kind of, I guess, if you believe it's a positive story, I began to be the angel on the shoulder of the estate at that point about the possibilities for the exegesis. Of course, I had no idea exactly how in the world to get it done, but I started to talk through my shirt about that, and just trying to figure out some ways to make it possible. I'm going to hold it there. Leave other details for later.
Well, I came into the project a little bit after that, on Jonathan's recommendation. The daughters were now ready to actually find out what's in the exegesis, but they didn't want to read it. Jonathan didn't want to read it. A lot of people wanted to read it, but as the first step to thinking about what to do with it, in what form it could be published, or whether indeed they wanted it to be published, they needed somebody to start reading it and talking to them about what was in it and what kind of publication would make sense, if any. So I started doing that.
I have to interrupt you because you're incapable of saying why you were so uniquely credentialed to be the person. Okay. Pamela was a perfect storm of capacity. She grew up in Berkeley, went to Berkeley High, ended up writing a dissertation in the rhetoric department on the Sutton version of those writings. So she was already a scholar, one of the only scholars to attack what there was to attack in this material. Secondarily, she had another advanced degree in archival library science. Okay? How many people on earth could possibly be more qualified? And third most, she was a dear friend of mine, and I could say in complete good faith to the daughters who were so trepidatious, you can trust Pamela with this, to basically go into this area that is so prickly for you, so terrifying.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I actually can say those things about myself. It's just I was taking up chronologically story. I can also say that Jonathan was the one who turned me on to Philip K. Dick. He made me read Ubik when we were working together in a Berkeley bookstore. So the conspiracy goes back. But anyway, so I started reading it in 2008. Not yet any kind of book contract or anything on the horizon, just to really advise them on it, tell them what was in it. And I became, well, first of all, I pretty quickly came to the conclusion that it should not, the first thing that needed to happen was not a book publication of the entire thing. So then I started talking to my friend Rich, who I also know from the rhetoric department at Berkeley. And we had been talking about the exegesis for a decade already, off and on, about the possibility of a digital exegesis. And I'll let him talk more about that part of the project. And what happened was that all of a sudden, while I was reading it and while we were talking about how you would fund a digital exegesis, suddenly the estate got a new agent, and we had a book contract to put out a book version of the exegesis in very, very little amount of time. So then I became the main hands-on editor of the book, and I spent the next year totally submerged in exegesis.
Submerged. This is a tale of dumb luck because I had the dumb luck to know Jonathan and Pam from Berkeley. I remember seeing Jonathan's Ubik tattoo sometime in the late 1980s after I discovered the work of Philip K. Dick down in UC Irvine when I pulled a book for random from the shelf trying to escape the first Gulf War. And when I pulled that book at random, Radio Free Albemuth fell out the other side. And it was about a guy who moved down from Berkeley to Orange County and began receiving the voices of aliens. And I'd just done that. So, and so I was like, hey, this book's about me. And I read it in about 24 hours, and probably a lot of you are familiar with this symptom that you then begin to amass and accrue every possible Phil K. Dick novel that you can find. And, ended up writing a dissertation about molecular biology, and ended up out at Penn State, where they said, well, we're an enormous place that aren't really paying attention to what you're doing. What would you like to teach? And I started teaching classes on Philip K. Dick, and we would do 15 novels in 15 weeks. And people would leave messages on my answering machine, because we had answering machines back then, saying, Professor Doyle, I don't know what fiction is anymore. And so I've been doing that ever since, and it was the experience of seeing the effect of these books on undergraduates that really kind of started to feed back onto me, because I'd already been convinced that, for example, Phil K. Dick understood what molecular biology really augured and meant better than most of the scientists and researchers that I was interviewing and working with. But in the background, it was always, we would always get to Valis, and then we'd be like, the tractate. Where is the tractate? So I started unknowingly, in parallel, every year, it was like a ritual. I would try to contact Russ Galen, and sometimes I would be successful, and he would write a very polite email back and say that he would discuss it with the estate, and my stalking continued. But then an enormous set of coincidences came together, as often is the case, and I just happened to be coming out to Berkeley because, for some strange reason, George Lucas had invited my wife to come out to his ranch for a documentary, and right across the bay, there was the Exegesis. And Pam brought it out to a friend's house, a professor from Berkeley. I remember lugging it up those steps, of those steep steps, and we did some cut up even. We took Xeroxes of it and cut it up and just dipped into it at random to see, what does this thing taste like, And it was incredible, it was, it seemed like it could harbor that golden key, So then, as Pamela says, things very quickly came together, and my role for the current book was that I got to work with a bunch of students at Penn State, and we were meant to be this sort of swarm scholarship that we would somehow, each of us, take a folder and read through it and say, Pam, look at this. This is worth looking at again. And that was an incredible experience, because those students, each and every one of them, at some point, at some 3 a.m. moment, felt like the exegesis had been written entirely to them and for them. And that is one of the unique characteristics, I think, of the exegesis. And then I got to start working a little bit with Erik Davis, whose career I'd followed for a long time and read a lot of his work. And I felt like we were on sort of a convergent, interesting path. So it's just so interesting how then everything just comes together. And I saw Erik in Indianapolis, and Erik says, I think, maybe I'll become annotations editor. And so I ended up doing some annotations and working with Erik, and we were back and forth on email, chopping things up, and the thing out of the labor of Pam and Jonathan came into being between covers.
Well, I also did kind of throw in a little, Berkeley infection in, I think it was 1985, when I was just after my first year of college, and I lived at the notorious Barrington Hall, which was a student co-op at Berkeley that by that point was just the feverish dregs of the counterculture. So it was a very fun and interesting place to live, and I didn't help matters by deciding that summer to intensively study Aleister Crowley, the Tarot, and Robert Eichmann Wilson. So it was a weird summer, and during that weird summer, there was one guy named Gill, I don't remember his last name, who lived at Barrington Hall, who was unusually intellectual for the inhabitants, and sort of feverishly handed me Phil Dick book, which is the first time, and because I was in Berkeley, I was actually able to buy a number at the time, and so I very much associate my reception of that virus with Berkeley and with the underground in Berkeley. It felt sort of like fresher, more authentic somehow, coming in that weird context. And I wrote my senior thesis on Phil Dick, so it's been part of my life, and it really, in many ways, set up my major set of questions and interests in the counterculture and information theory and popular culture and mysticism and in the curious mixtures of all these things. And it was a very weird and wonderful experience to be able to I was fascinated by the exegesis, of course, and gobbled up the student volume and really influenced a lot of the ways I think about, particularly about how cybernetics and information theory mix up with mysticism in our kind of postmodern context. And so I'm not exactly sure why the editors decided to rope me in. I knew Jonathan before. I think I seemed relatively like I got the picture, and I was clearly able to produce things. And I was a freelance writer, so I could actually make deadlines most of the time and stuff. So it was a wonderful process, and I always really wanted to make sure that there were multiple. That there was a way to allow and encourage a wide variety of experiences of the exegesis, so that anybody coming in and opening up was not feeling like, oh, I have to believe that he had a genuine religious experience, or I have to believe that he's a crazy man and this is the record of the madness of an otherwise important author. Instead, that the exegesis opened up a wide variety of perspectives. So I was really happy to be able to bring in a number of voices to do these annotations. Partly also because I wanted to encourage the sense that, like, this exegesis can itself be an object of exegesis, of interpretation, and that's actually the freshest way, most interesting way to engage it, rather than just putting it in a category of revelation or craziness. And so it was a really fun thing to work with a variety of annotators from quite a wide range of perspectives, including some people who were very skeptical about the value or the ontological nature of these revelations. So I helped. I worked on some of the folders, which was really great. The experience of sitting there trying to transcribe the stuff and figure out what was interesting and what was not interesting, which is a very important question we could talk about. But also just working with the text on a more larger editorial level and working on the notations and putting together and writing a lot of the glossary materials, because we wanted to give people a handhold. Again, it would have been in some ways nicer as a interactive text, which I'm sure we'll talk about, especially when you get into the question of how you annotate and show connections between all the proper names that are in there. What is he referring to? Where do these quotes from Bach come from? And it was really fun to have to unpack a lot of these nuggets and puzzles. Some of these things we wrestled over for weeks. Like, what does this mean? Come on, it's got to mean something. Who knows? Somebody knows. No, Google search isn't working. Oh no, because he's spelling it wrong. Oh, it was a lot of fun puzzle work that was really quite exhilarating. Probably because it was collective as well. It wasn't just one person. We were all trying to figure out a lot of these issues. So it was really quite a lot of fun.
I was brought in to do some of these annotations, and I feel like my strength was in pointing out some of the biographical significance of what Philip K. Dick was writing about. For instance, if he mentioned the options that he was doing on Blade Runner or something like that, we wanted to give some background. It's a really interesting story about how he turned down the money to do the novelization and instead did Transmigration. But one interesting story I want to tell is that there was a time in my Philip K. Dick study when I was fairly convinced that the entire 2374 experience was just a big joke that Dick made up, that it never happened, and that he was using it to build a career. I thought it was quite savvy. And that belief came to an end the day that Erik and I went over to Pam's house, and I actually saw a copy of the Exegesis and just the size of it. The sheer density of it was instantly evident that this was not the work of a sane person. In meaning that clearly he wasn't making it up. That something had happened and that he was intensely invested in it, and that I had been wrong to imagine that it was a hoax. So that was a good realization, I think. I'll send it back to Ted.
All right. Ted, can I walk up things refresh just on that? Yeah. Rich, I was just thinking that one of the most interesting things from my perspective, and again, I'm referencing all the way back to the very first glimmerings of how this may be handled, and a couple of you are also witnesses to this, John Fairchild, I think, that the irony is that this path which you conceived, a very idealistic one, of distributed scholarship or swarm scholarship, which in some ways it remains the future of the exegesis, because I think that the next transcriptions and the production of an actual complete exegesis, whenever this goal may be attained, and you'll be talking about this more, is going to be accomplished effectively by a kind of swarm scholarship, by volunteers transcribing the even longer and denser and more impossible and more bewildering sequences. But the irony of this is that this is also the very beginning of the project. This was Paul's first response. I think it was, for Paul Williams, very much a man of the counterculture, very much a kind of open source thinker by deep, inherent disposition. His first thought was, well, we've got a lot of fans who'd like to know what this is. Let's have them all become the transcribers. And before he was really authorized to do this, but also before anyone, in a sense, cared enough to say no either, he just handed out chunks, and there was a very early flare of distributed swarm transcription, and some people were involved in this. And of course, I think one of them was J. Kinney, who became, because he was typing out sections and trying to figure out what he was looking at, became the Columbus in a way. He wrote that first report, which, for better and worse, I think there's some, he threw out some misleading flares as well as some enticing ones in that initial report. But the very first anyone really had to say about what the exegesis was like was this man named J. Kinney, who'd been handed a chunk of it to transcribe and wrote a kind of report that was published in the newsletter in the early days. So it's just interesting how the thing itself seems to provoke this reaction, which is also mirrored, although it was a more formal arrangement, in the way, you asked, why did we reach out to you, Erik? We needed help. You look at this thing, and the immediate thing you do is you want someone to throw a lifeline down to you. You want to be tethered to the planet by another human being while you're making this forward. I'm sorry. Also, in Erik's story, so Barrington Hall, where Erik was living, this is just one of the wonderful recursions. There's a photograph of Barrington Hall in an early Philip K. Dick newsletter. The reason there's a photograph of Barrington Hall is that I noticed one day walking past Barrington Hall, which was a building that fascinated me for its obvious. It was like a building that was tripping. And in fact, I later went on to accidentally do what turned out to be some Barrington Hall acid myself. But someone had spray painted Anne Webb over one of the doorways. And I thought, this belongs in the Philip K. Dick newsletter. So I had a photograph of it snapped, and we ran it in the newsletter. Just, hey, there's a building that says Anne Webb.
Okay, so I'm going to suppress the urge to ask a question about Philip K. Dick and acid, which is something that Erik Davis has also written about. So I'm interested in what you all think is the next step in exegesis criticism. I understand if you need to take a break. Many of us are writers, whether we be fans, academics, independent scholars, filmmakers, and also what advice do you have for those of us who would like to begin a more rigorous investigation?
That's a question you want to take. I mean, the thing that speaking, I think, paraphrasing Pam's opinion, and then she can jump in when she realizes what I'm doing. The first thing to say is, we feel, without wishing to claim any undue authority over something that is literally impossible to be authoritative about. It destroys a reader's or an editor's or a critic's or a scholar's authority. It is a machine for disabling your presumptions, right? But having made that disclaimer, I think we have a lot of pride, as vast and confusing and overwhelming as the text is. I think we have a lot of pride in the notion that we did produce a really representative and relatively appealing and involving and readable percentage of the whole. That the first thing to say, and this is never to discourage what should and would and will be extended involvement by other readers and other scholars and another kind of publishing framework, but a lot of what we omitted, and Pamela knows this better than I do, I'm partly relying on her, is like what you're seeing, but much less good. Okay? It's just more wheel spinning, more obtuse, more frustrated, and sometimes also more depressed in tone. And so, you know, we made our selections on a basis of wanting to, you know, if we couldn't give you everything, we wanted to make you feel that you were having the best experience with the most representative and appealing aspects of this manuscript.
Yeah, I wrote, as he said, I wrote my dissertation on the exegesis without having read it yet. I had read the Sutton, I read it Sutton over and over. It's embedded in my heart. So every time I came across an actual piece of the exegesis that was from Sutton, but I didn't actually know, having written it, whether I had written anything that actually was true about the exegesis, because I didn't know what the exegesis actually was. So as an editor, one of my, I guess my big sense of what my responsibility was to give a version of the exegesis that someone like me, scholars or very invested fans, could actually get from it a real sense of what was in there and what it was like to read it, including that it was impossible to read, that it was overwhelming to read. And so I always thought our exegesis book should be too big. That was an important part of it. But it also shouldn't be tormentingly big. There should be digestible enough chunks, there should be breaks, so that not everyone had to have the reading experience that I had when I was reading it, which was, you know, very overwhelming and difficult, sometimes really awful, because to read through a folder, you know, just non-stop is actually to be inside the head that is manically thinking these thoughts, and it's impossible to find, you know, your ground. You lose any sense of whether it's good or crazy very easily, and so something to break up that experience for people, to make it less awful to read, and also to make the beautiful parts of it sing, because there are just these tremendously beautiful parts. And the other thing that had frustrated me, having only read the Sutton, trying to write about it, was that it wasn't chronological, and there were no chronological notes telling me whether whether there were changes, whether this really was just circular, repetitive, and never got anywhere, or whether it had gotten somewhere, whatever that might mean, whether it grew and changed. And so I was committed to trying to chronologize it, even though I didn't know whether that would be possible going into it, because there are very few external markers. He didn't date. He very rarely dated anything. So the process of putting it into chronological order as best I could was also one of finding out whether it was meaningful to put it in chronological order, and whether you could trace the development of ideas, changes, insights, and actually get a sense of a journey out of it, which I hoped I would, because I didn't want it to think that it was just, you know, this black hole of ultimately futile despair. And so that was very moving story. I was very invested in it. I could see the through lines. I could see the breaks, the doubts, the revitalizations, the ways that it sort of grew out in different directions that were unexpected, but all from these seeds that were there from the beginning. It was a remarkable whole for me, but I'm sure very few people are actually reading it from beginning to end. And I'm really interested to hear criticism and just personal reactions from people who do, as well as all the scholarly work, obviously, that needs to be done from many disciplines and perspectives.
I just wanted to follow up on these comments. I think the interesting loop that Jonathan traces there about the immediate response to the sheer enormity of the exegesis testifies both to its reality and it calls forth something capable of reading it, which I think we're saying in a way that none of us, with the possible exception of Pamela, are capable of, right? That it brings it actually means to call forth something else. Something else needs to come into existence to be able to read it. And that's something else I wanted to invite you to. I'm calling it to myself Operation Big Noodle, which you may remember jammed the big system in one of the Phil's novels. And it's the digital exegesis project, which we now finally have on a software platform that's going to allow for a different kind of reading of the exegesis, one that allows for tagging so that you could, for example, look up and see, hey, is there another mention of Amweb here? Can I correlate Amweb with Barrington Hall? Yes, further away?
Just a tiny bit further away.
How about there? Yeah, good. I did it again. And so that's a really exciting phenomenon, and I feel like, we've been patient, and the estate has been really kind, and I think we're very close to being able to launch that website. And part of the reason I really, really wanted to come out here is to be the messenger for Operation Big Noodle, and to say I want to welcome and extend an invitation to everybody here, and that you should tell two friends, and they should tell two friends, and that the URL will be available, probably in the next month for crowdscription of the digital exegesis. And as it grows, we'll learn more and more about the exegesis and begin to interact with the exegesis in a way which I think will both complement and sort of extend the remarkable experience of both dipping into the volume that Pam and Jonathan have prepared, but also one that sort of makes it seem much more connected, less like a journey and more like a whole.
Yeah, I'm just, in terms of what the next steps are, I'm coming back to the same distinction I made in my talk between the interest in the relationship between this material and Dick's fiction, and then separately, just the interest in this material as an example of a unique event and textual event surrounding issues of revelation and madness and esotericism and cybernetics, and just very fascinating kind of cluster of things. And in a way, those are sort of separate issues. I think there is a lot to be done on how this material relates to his fictions, particularly Valis and the Divine Invasion. The Divine Invasion in particular it's very clear the way that the events that he's describing and elaborating in the exegesis become the seed crystals for the narratives and some of the visions that are inside of the book. So you really get to see, like, wow, what's the relationship between at least his own description of his visionary experiences and hypnagogic voices and how those things get played out in fiction, and it allows us to see him playing this game of how does he use fiction in order to deal with the claims or potential claims of his experiences. Valis, of course, as well, since there's so much material. Just even the question of what does he include? How does he transform elements that are in the exegesis into Valis? It's a very interesting question. Why are the tractates all not exactly exegetical material? It's always transformed. some of the comments and conversations that come through are very clear. And one element I also want to bring up, because it's subtle, but I think really, really important. And you pick it up, especially in the time just before he's writing Valis and during, is that he talks about the people he's having these conversations with. And we tend to think of him as just sitting alone in a room and writing all night long, which he was doing. But just the same way that you can't understand Valis, the novel, without really diving into this question of friendship, of cannabis-fueled conversation, of speculative late-night, buddy rants. That material is also woven into the exegesis. So even though in some ways it's a profoundly, onanistic text, it also is woven together with other voices. And the way that happens, I think, is a really important key to that aspect of Dick's work. I know that Jonathan and I have had discussions about this aspect of the Chronic City, is a great exploration of some of that element of Dick's own inspiration, his own intellectual life. But I think it's also a site for a certain kind of philosophical and religious speculation that is actually part of our cultural heritage that we don't really think about, like the value of the stone late-night conversation with your friends. I mean, it's a real site that I think we can see the exegesis playing with. In terms of the other, not in terms of the relationship to the fiction, there's a whole lot of really, really interesting things going on there. I mean, it just goes, and you can go in many, many different directions. His relationship to the history of esotericism, how he's reading esotericism, how he's misreading religion and esotericism, because a lot of religion is misreading, creative misreading in Harold Bloom's phrase. Somebody does something like, well, let's take that and twist it a little bit, sometimes consciously, often unconsciously. The text itself has patterns, rhythms that are very unusual. And I remember another comment that Pamela made one time when we were sitting there. I would go over once a week or a couple times a month, and sometimes she would just be in this sort of catatonic state, and I was sort of there just like, hey, it's like, I'll be your lifeline right now, whatever. And I remember at one point she said, she just looking at all this stuff going, how many, just in Berkeley alone, how many exegeses are there tucked away in basements and attics? And it's a very interesting question, because in a way, Philip K. Dick's fame, his excellence, gives us an excuse to look at a kind of literary production that's actually quite pervasive, which is the solo, weird, smart guy, or often guy, not always, but generally, who just spends an extraordinary amount of time creating these weird systems that mutate and change and are paranoid and insightful and depressing and repetitive and all this kind of stuff. There's tons of stuff like that. Nobody looks at it except for certain psychoanalytic approaches. And now we have an excuse to go, well, let's actually look at one of these by a particularly interesting mind. So there's a lot to be said and done just as an expression, a literary expression of a certain kind of relationship to writing, altered states of consciousness, psychological obsession, and the history of esotericism and religion. So I think there really is a lot to be done.
It's interesting that as we've already noted, that the exegesis makes you feel dumb. It makes you feel like you have nothing to say. And so what's been said so far is the standard line, well, it's a record of Dick's endless theorizing. It's a good pairing of words. So I think the next step in the scholarship is to lose that idea, because I think it's taking us in the wrong direction. There is some endless theorizing, but it's, to my mind, not as circular, not as wandering as maybe it's made out to be. Well, what it seems to be is some fairly traditional Christian theology, which is frankly not something we're particularly adept at reading in our society these days. So I think the next step in the scholarship is to divorce ourselves of some of our secular sense and read it as a traditional kind of Christian theology. And maybe it's heretical here and there, but I think that's part of the tradition too. So I hope we move from these sort of blanket statements that offer absolutely no insight to something that can offer some insight once we find those folks that can offer us insight into what's in the exegesis.